Hello, salut tout le monde. My name is Jimmy Smith and welcome to the advanced version of Key Grape Varieties Riesling. So we are going to look at the brilliant, noble, regal, wonderful, royal Riesling grape variety, possibly one of the most well-adored variety in the wine industry. In the world, although it has had a bit of negativity over the years because it is a grape variety which has been produced as a sweet wine. Most people only see it as a sweet wine, but of course there are many different varieties of styles of Riesling produced. It is very much likely to come from the Rheingau. So this is the district just off the river Rhine, north of Frankfurt, near Hochheim. And this is it's kind of famous area, and that's because we have a mention here going back to around the 15th century. So there's a fair bit of history behind this this style, and then other further mentions going into the 16th century around other parts of Germany. So it's very much likely to come from the Rheingau area or the River Rhine. It actually has a parent-offspring relationship with Gouais Blanc, and Gouais Blanc is a very old-school variety which, before phylloxera, was fairly prolific. You would find a big volume of this variety, and many grapes can trace back their lineage to Gouais Blanc. So it's quite a famous one. So therefore, there is a relationship with Riesling, which means it's related to a lot of the grapes of the continental Europe zone, such as Furmint going towards the east in Hungary and Austria, Gamay Noir Jus Blanc, Chardonnay, and of course things like Pinot Noir, Aligoté, etc., etc. Probably around 80, 85 grapes it's therefore linked to because of that parent-offspring relationship. So it really is one of the old school key grape varieties. Despite the naming, Welsh Riesling, which is not from Wales, and it's not Riesling, and Riesling Italico is also not Riesling. They are different varieties in their different countries, Welsh Riesling being mainly from Austria and Hungary, and Riesling Italico from areas like, of course, Italy, northern Italy, but it is not related to those styles. And Riesling being the famous grape in places like Geisenheim, which is pretty much the main institute of enology of Germany, they have used it to breed other varieties, so crossing it with other styles, such as Madeleine Royale, which is where Müller-Thurgau came in, which was created in the late 19th century in Geisenheim. So it has often been the building blocks for production of quality wines through the breeding programs. Going into the vineyard, so Riesling is, of course, very well suited to cold conditions. It's very hard wood. It can survive quite harsh, bitter winters, and of course does quite well in those cold conditions. So Germany, therefore, is a unique and important place for Riesling, as is Alsace, that we find just across the Rhine in France today. So remarkably important in cold areas. And that's important to know. It is in fact best in these cold areas where it makes quite wonderfully fresh wines with high acids, which have a brilliant ability to age. So that's Riesling in cold climates, but it will be produced in warmer climates as well, like Washington State or most of Washington State, and places down like Eden and Clare Valley in South Australia. So we will find it producing very decent wines in those areas as well. It's also remarkably handy and useful for a grape grower because it is a late budder. So it therefore will actually not suffer with spring frosts as much as other varieties. So it's a very consistent variety on that front. It does need to be found on our best sites, on the certainly the best sites, including better soils, soils like slate and schist we'll talk about in a second, but also on different aspect facing south, certainly in these colder areas, to ripen to the fullest. But in cold conditions, a slower, longer ripening, but enough sunshine to actually fully ripen the variety. So that's where Germany comes into play quite nicely. It is very site specific, as it is found on a variety of soils. The famous is in Germany. It is found on slate or some schist. These are metamorphic rocks, which are sedimentary in nature, but also compacted down through time with some granitic-based rock as well. So this is a very well-draining and quite heat-retentive soil, which means that the grapes can ripen remarkably well. So it is very site-specific. Now, it's not to say that it's only best found on slate. If you go across the Rhine River from Germany into Alsace in France, there is in fact a huge mosaic of terroir soils for Riesling. It will be grown on the kind of volcanic soils of the Vosges Mountains, the slaty schist soils as well, sandstone that's found around the Vosges, but down towards limestones and marls and clays. There's a huge diversity, which means it will actually be quite different on these different soil types. That's what makes, I think, Alsace, if you are obviously studying wine, you'll know that Alsace is phenomenally interesting and you fall in love with it as a student of wine, because it's just an absolute wonderful place, a very small place, but with huge diversity. And also, it is remarkably clonally diverse in its home country, which is to be expected because it's grown there and evolved. We have around, I'd say about 80 different clones in place in Germany. Interestingly, across the river in Alsace, there's actually only probably just under 10 different clones. So there is a remarkable amount of clonal diversity in Germany. And rootstocks can be important as well, but you will find in Germany that some vines on slate soils, like in the Mosel and in the Rheingau, will be grown on their original rootstocks, pre-phylloxera, because slate does not house phylloxera. Phylloxera does not like those conditions. It's also, as a variety, quite susceptible to noble rot, which means that the fungal mold, botrytis, which happens at the end of the year, will actually affect Riesling on its long, gentle growth on the vine, which means in those humid conditions towards the end of the year, you will find it. And that will produce, of course, the very famous sweet wines like Trockenbeerenauslese and Beerenauslese found in Germany. With any German names, you just have to phonetically shout it and it sounds quite German. In the winery, Riesling will be harvested and brought into the winery and often treated quite frequently under reductive techniques. So this means things like anaerobic winemaking. And Germany specifically was the center of the modern movement of things like stainless steel and clean fermentations, inoculated yeast, making fresh, light, and quite acidic wines. So therefore, they are, of course, big into this kind of production still today. So reductive winemaking is common in Rieslings to make wines that are quite fresh. So they will be very primary led in their youth, but will develop tertiary in their aging capability. They will not have many secondary notes because, of course, they don't tend to go through malolactic. They don't tend to have lees, although that is being experimented with, and oak is very uncommon. Now, Germany has quite a significant amount of inoculated fermentations, as does parts of Alsace, and as does places like Washington and Australia, to create this crisp style Riesling. But, of course, like all grapes, there are winemakers that start to look at wild yeast fermentations. In Germany, the famous estate in the Mosel called J.J. Prum, today run by Katharina Prum and Manfred. These they have always wild yeast fermented, so the natural native yeasts from the grapes are used to ferment their wines. And actually, that does create an issue a little bit later, and I'll talk about reductive aroma compounds with that a little bit later in a few bullet points time. So you will find some of these wild yeast fermentations as well, certainly for some premium examples. Riesling is very, very frequently found as a varietal and not blended. Germany, it is nearly always on its own. Alsace sits mostly on its own, but you may find it blended in things like Gentil and Edelsviker, which are the blended styles of Alsace, but normally found as a varietal. You will find, of course, within the grape, there is a big diversity from still to sparkling, from dry to sweet. And just a quick note on sweet. The Germans don't like to use that terminology because of the negativity they've had in the past. They will call their sweet wines, things like Cabernets, Spätlesers, etc. They will call them fruity wines and not sweet wines. So it's either trocken, dry, or fruity, which is the sweeter styles. But a big diversity of styles are produced across the world. And the thing I mentioned earlier, now with wild yeast fermentations, you may find that in fact a bit of reduction can be found in the wines. And these reductive notes are often kind of a sulfury, struck match kind of note. Some people associate it with mineral, which is often a big misnomer. But you will find on these premium, young, top Rieslings like J.J. Prum, for instance, and Donhoff, you will find that if you open them a bit too young, it's like a little warning, actually. It's telling you you shouldn't be drinking it. But if you do open it, you may smell initially this kind of sulfury note to it. And that is actually a reductive note produced by the wild yeast fermentations. It's that very long terminology, which is like benzen methanethyl, which I cannot remember the full name of it, but it is a bit of a reductive compound which will blow off with some oxidation or age. Riesling's key locations, already sort of talked about many of these. Of course, Germany is the epicenter, the kind of nucleus for this grape variety and the birthplace. About 23,000 hectares all over, mainly in the southwest, bordering places like France. And the Mosel and the Rheingau would be famous, but there's the Rheinhessen, there's Pfalz, there's Nahe, and there's many other little parts as well. So it certainly is diverse within that country. France, and that's mainly Alsace, just across the river, Rhine, and that's just in the shadow of the Vosges Mountains. Riesling is actually quite often dry here, but you will find with some of the Grand Crus some more premium, sweeter sort of edged styles, maybe sort of medium sweet can be found. And in fact, by law, standard, what we call just Alsace Riesling will have to be dry. Australia has about 4,500 hectares, and it is the New World leading area for it. South Australia, but a bit in Western as well, and some in Tasmania. Some really lovely stuff in Tasmania. Washington State, there is probably the single biggest estate in Washington. 3,000 hectares in total here, but a key area, a bit warmer out here, but there are some cooler parts as well. But Washington State often producing towards a drier style, but will have sweeter examples as well. Dr. Lucen is found out here with the Aurorica Riesling, which is teamed up with Domaine Saint Michel. Austria, about 2,000 hectares under vine and becoming more important along the Danube. And then New York. I've thrown this in here. It's not much, but on the eastern seaboard of the United States, in North New York State, around the Finger Lakes, there is an exciting emerging amount of Riesling being produced. So that's near Buffalo, Rochester, quite close to the Niagara Falls. Very cool climate. And the vines must be in the proximity of these very deep lakes, the Finger Lakes. So some rather good stuff. Lots of German influence in that area. So what is it like, Riesling, as a style? So you'll see here, you have a bounty of fruits, and you'll see that there is lemon, apple, lime, peach, and really that movement from citric to stone or even slightly tropical is going from a cold to a warmer climate. So you will find a bounty of these kind of conditions. If there's a bit more sugar, you may find a bit more tropical note as well, like passion fruit, but moreover things like mango, which comes through. Now, younger Rieslings can also be quite floral. So things like jasmine, Chamomile, quite common on younger Rieslings. And then, of course, Riesling can mature. And as it matures, those primary characteristics dumb down a little bit. There is no secondary because of there is no winemaking sort of oak malolactic or yeast. And then it goes into its tertiary phase, which is seen here in the top left. You'll see that we have a volatile compound, which is petrol or associated. So things like oil, kerosene kind of notes can be found. Honey or toast as well, as you can see here. But also things like nuts and pine nut, pistachio can be found as well. So they do develop these wonderful mature notes, which are quite haunting in character. And when you have a nice sort of 20, 30-year-old top German Riesling, these notes will eventually come out. They're not instantaneous. It does take in very cool areas longer to have these compounds, normally in excess of 5 years, but normally around 10. In warmer zones, they do come out a bit more. So in places like Australia and Washington, you will find these tertiary compounds out in a few years, maybe even 2. So it can be a rather lovely grape. So I remember when I first got into Riesling, I loved it because it reminded me of being in a petrol forecourt filling up a car. Just that lovely aromatic. I like that. Many people do, some people don't. So it may translate whether you like Riesling or not. So I do hope that you've enjoyed your advanced look at the key grape variety of Riesling. It's been an absolute pleasure to take you through it. There is a beginner's version of this available as well on the YouTube channel. Please have a look at that if you found that this was too much in depth. Now, this is the end slide. So once again, if you have any comments or questions, @Wine with Jimmy is my handle, but also the 2 wine schools and my wine bar if you wish to get in touch. If you're from London, you should have been to one of these. If you're from outside of London, don't fear. You can come and see us at any of these. Come for a class or come for a glass, either at our school or our bar. Been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and see you again soon. Cheers.